Canada got something of a reprieve from U.S. tariffs, at least for 30 days and counting. But what happens now? Dominic LeBlanc is Canada's Minister of Finance and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Thank you for being with us.
Hi, Amanda. Glad to be here.
So quite a reprieve. Obviously, the time gives us a chance to do what? What's the order of business to make sure they don't come back?
Probably two things. Continue the conversation around border security, the fight against fentanyl. It turned out that that really was what President Trump was focused on Monday. I think we have a good story to tell. We have done a lot of work with the Americans. We totally share the concern of the United States government in terms of the fight against fentanyl. And we're stepping up. We're doing more. So my colleagues, the Commissioner of the RCMP, the Head of Border Services Canada, will be in Washington working with their counterparts to reinforce the shared commitment to fight against fentanyl and ensure continued border security. But at the same time, and President Trump said that on Monday evening, he talked about structuring an economic deal with Canada. Mm-hmm. So I hope to be in Washington next week, talk to Secretary Bessent and Howard Lutnick. Our idea would be to have those conversations with the Americans and put ourselves in a position when Howard Lutnick does his sort of global tariff review on April 1st that the president announced, that we're in a position hopefully to avoid some of this turbulence.
We've heard things like access by U.S. banks to our market, for instance. We've heard a lot of talk about dairy. Do you have a sense of what might be on their list? It seems to change.
It does, and that's the challenge, right? We hadn't heard about banks until the president started talking to the prime minister about it on Monday, and he talked about it publicly. So there again, obviously, I was in Ottawa yesterday. The Deputy Minister of Finance and I, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, will try and understand what the American concern is and what Canada might do to meet their concern. But we also have a comprehensive free trade agreement that President Trump negotiated some years ago and proclaimed at the time was a very big win for the United States. We thought also it was an important win for Canada. So we're not in the mood to sort of trade away a bunch of things that we had discussed with his administration some years ago. But I would be irresponsible not to have the conversation. And one of the things we're hoping is to start by establishing some basic economic facts. So one of the challenges, apart from the goalpost shifting, is that somebody will throw out a number about a trade deficit. And it includes certain things, it doesn't include certain things. So my conversations with Howard Lutnick last weekend were, why don't we start by agreeing, your department, the Commerce Department, Department of Finance, let's agree on some basic economic facts. And then we can have a conversation to answer concerns they have. And of course, we'll get there with our own concerns as well.
Of course, we hear this $200 billion number. I actually saw a clip from Oprah Winfrey with Donald Trump from the late 90s, and he said $200 billion. It makes you wonder about the education level around these issues, but that may not be the driving force. Do you worry that there's sort of a left hand not knowing what the right is doing in Washington right now? The president may do things that don't really bear any relationship to facts.
The challenge for us is he talked publicly about a $200 billion deficit. When I went with the Prime Minister to Mar-a-Lago a month and a half ago, after his election, it was $109 billion. But again, you take out commodities, you take out energy, and if you focus on manufactured goods, they actually have a surplus. So one of the challenges is to establish the common facts. But any partner in an important commercial arrangement like that, you'd want to understand what their concerns are. And we think that we have answers and ways to accommodate their concerns that preserves something as important as comprehensive free trade with the United States.
If we do reopen the negotiations early, and it feels a little bit as though that may be where this is headed, what's on the table for us? What might you see offering up or changing or being willing to accept?
So I get that you have to ask those questions. We want to be very prudent because for two reasons. One, we have no indication from the Americans they want to reopen. There's a review in 2026. Some premiers, including the Premier of Quebec, for example, have been urging us to publicly ask them to reopen the deal. If that turns out to be the case, and if in fact somebody triggers that process, we'll arrive at those conversations obviously ready to defend the Canadian economic interest and to support things that are in the economic interest of Canada. But we're not arriving in Washington with a list of things we're prepared to give away or things that we're not prepared to discuss. I think we have to be open-minded and reassure the Americans that there are so many common interests and so many common success stories. Let's focus on that and not get bogged down in rabbit holes some of which, as you say, may not entirely be attached to the facts.
Are supply management issues on the table this time around? It's been a third rail in Canadian politics. Every party seems to say we're not touching supply management, even though all of our trading partners find it an irritant. Might that be on the table finally?
We don't think so. It's certainly not our intention to reopen that conversation. It was discussed in the agreement that was signed by the American administration of President Trump in his first term. We understand the importance to Canadians of the supply management system, so it's certainly not our intention to arrive at a bargaining table with some plan to either reopen that conversation or certainly to do something that would weaken it.
We know that you're looking at a budget, as you must do, Finance Minister, beginning the process of thinking about that. Kind of difficult to do given the degree of uncertainty. There's always scenarios that you lay out. In the worst case scenario, there are tariffs imposed and you have to come up with a plan. There was mention of a spending plan, of a relief package for Canadians. How robust is that? Will you continue working on that and putting details around it just in case?
Totally. And that would be part of the budget exercise. I think we were ready in a very immediate context last weekend to provide support to workers and sectors of the economy and businesses. Very encouraged by the enthusiasm of premiers to partner with us, including using provincial government fiscal resources to support sectors and workers. So I was very confident last weekend that we would have the right answer to Canadian businesses and Canadian workers, but we do have some time to continue that work. There's no doubt, again, if we're in a situation, all of this is hypothetical, let's say we're in a situation where the Americans have imposed tariffs, let's say we're in a situation where we've responded and we've imposed retaliatory tariffs, those revenues that the government would be collecting would obviously be used to support workers and sectors that are unfairly hit by these unfair tariffs. So it's not a revenue source for the government. We would want to use those revenues in partnership with provinces to directly support workers and businesses that are being hammered by this. So that's the kind of conversation we'll continue to have. And I'll have a new boss in a few weeks. There'll be a new prime minister by the middle of March. Parliament comes back at the end of March. There's a lot of uncertainty, but I didn't think it would be a good outing to meet my new boss for the first time and say, hey, what do you think? Do you think maybe we should think about a budget? I'd prefer to go to him or her and say, look, we've been working on a series of options. This is my suggestion of what a framework might look like. And he or she will obviously want to weigh in, and we'll be in a position, if there ultimately is a decision, to present that in Parliament. But you're right, the tariff question, all of this will factor into what Parliament decides it wants to do in April and May.
Even if we manage to ward off tariffs, we're in a new era of trade and protectionism globally, but
absolutely.
certainly with the U.S. Do you see a budget that would address that in terms of making investments and spending choices in Canada to try to reshape how we deal with our economy and trade and how our manufacturers and exporters operate?
It's a perfect question. So let's say we have a long-term reprieve from this dangling threat of tariffs. That would be the best situation for the Canadian economy, clearly. It still behooves a government to take this threat that was very real and very significant but a few days ago and still remains a source of concern, and figure out a way, again, provinces and territories massively suited up, business leaders, bank CEOs have talked to me about this. There really is, I think, an effort to recognize both our dependence on the U.S. market, internal free trade in Canada. I was the internal trade minister for a number of years. We made a lot of progress, but business leaders as important as Victor Dodige at CIBC have been talking to us for a long time about actually wiping out those internal trade barriers. There's momentum now that we might not have easily found 2 months ago. So let's not waste a crisis to fix some structural things, both in Canada, but in terms of our relationship with other trading partners, that perhaps the normal headwind of government might have made it harder to do.
We talked for a long time about trade diversification. What do you see from your role and this government's role as the sort of ability to help businesses think beyond the U.S.? We talk about it. Everyone is saying, let's not let a crisis go to waste. Can we actually diversify trade to new markets? And what's the role of government in that? There
has been, for a bunch of reasons, an over-reliance on the U.S. I think of small exporters in Atlantic Canada, where I come from, that say they would like to sell their wood windows and doors into the European market, but they might have to be in a position where it's not profitable for a few years until they can get architects and contractors in certain European cities to specify their products in these construction jobs. So it's a simple example where Export Development Canada, regional development agencies, the industry department, very much with the cooperation of provinces and territories, should figure out a way to help them. And if it means supporting them financially for a period of time while they have a plan to develop new markets, that's very much value added for the Canadian economy, and including government spending. Because if we don't try and do that and we don't lower the reliance on one market, if you have one customer that buys 80% of your stuff, you could figure out that perhaps you don't do very well on the price, or if the customer gets irritated with you, it's not a good day. So we're in that situation now. Let's hope that we can collectively find a way out of this.
One of the tensions, of course, in any spring budget would be the fact that spending would be looked for and maybe even required in the event of tariffs. But we also need some fiscal prudence. The Canadian dollar demands it, at the very least. If we have a massive deficit, it'll weaken us further in other ways. How do you marry those two things? How do you match them up?
You accept that premise as real, the premise you just said, that the continued significant spending in a bunch of areas has to be ratcheted down. My own view is things as simple as the growth of government need to be looked at. I think we have to look at taxation policy. We have accumulated a certain amount of snow in front of the plow over the last number of years that make us uncompetitive with the United States, but also speak to confidence in things as important as our currency. So I totally accept that premise. Obviously, a new prime minister will have views on that in the next 6 or 7 weeks. But I've taken note of a number of my colleagues who are seeking the leadership and might win, things like defense spending. So you hear premiers, you hear industry leaders say we absolutely have to get to 2% defense spending. I don't object to that idea at all. But there again, it's a choice to make. So that's a significant hit on the government's fiscal framework, probably a good one. But what's the trade-off, and what other areas are we going to look at? I don't think we can raise revenues anymore. So what areas are we looking at to be able to be in a position to both be fiscally responsible but meet the need of the moment? That's the challenge that I hope I can work on.
And of course, the other big challenge is the affordability issue is still the dominating theme for Canadians. It will be for the foreseeable future. None of these things will make that better. And the fixes, of course, that we're talking about for the Canadian economy, for growth, for productivity, are long-term, slow-moving. They don't put dollars in people's pockets immediately. Can we think long-term right now, or are we going to have to address the affordability question in shorter-term ways?
We have to do both, because you're right, continually putting a Band-Aid on the problem without looking at the source of the problem isn't probably very good medicine. Well, the same thing must be true in economics. So you're right, there is a huge pressure that families are feeling, individuals are feeling. You see it in housing, you see it in grocery costs, you see it across the board. Some sectors or some daily costs of living worse than others. And to say to people in my constituency in rural New Brunswick, well, good news, inflation is now down below 2%, hasn't actually reduced the cost of a lot of these goods. The cost isn't growing as fast as it was a couple of years ago, but you're right, they're still stuck with a bill that is higher than they can afford in some cases. So we got to do both. We have to understand the long-term causes of this. I think there's some good news. The Department of Finance tells me there's some indicators that are very encouraging, but politically and in the House of Commons, we have to figure out ways to support people in the short term as well.
We have to leave it there. We appreciate your time, Minister.
Amanda, thank you.
Dominic LeBlanc is Minister of Finance and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Coming up, the outlook for housing amid massive economic turmoil. Stay with us.